everyone, I'm Ari here with Rachel, and we're your hosts for the Merry Writer podcast. This week we're on episode 291, and we're asking, how do you write fantasy characters? Before we start, if you enjoy the show, consider checking out our coffee page. You can follow the page for free, as we've got plenty of goodies for all. If you're feeling generous, a one-off donation will get you access to more treats, or you can even become a Merry Writer for just $2 a month. For this, you get access to all the items that are currently in our shop, including exclusive goodies, as well as access to monthly bonuses, and all of this helps our podcast. If that's not your style, but you still enjoy the show, then please subscribe wherever you're listening if you haven't already, and do consider dropping us a like on YouTube. It does help the algorithm gods. Okay, so we're talking fantasy characters. And you might be going, what is a fantasy character? Probably not, but just in case you are, these are beings that would be in your fantasy story. And while all characters in a fantasy story are technically considered fantasy characters, what we're meaning in this episode is more likely to be your non-human, though often humanoid, but not always, characters you might want to create. Because if we take Lord of the Rings, you have elves and dwarves and hobbits, but you also have humans and man. And obviously, they would still be considered fantasy because it's in a fantasy story, but at the same time, they're based on humans in general. So we already know a lot about that. So types of fantasy characters. There are ones that we are quite familiar with. I'm assuming most people are familiar with. Those are your elves, fairies, fae, trolls, dwarves, vampires, shapeshifters, sirens, centaurs, anything like that that often has a humanoid feel to it. Then you've got those that are very specific to a certain story, such as hobbits, which were created by Tolkien. You can actually create your own and have a specific race and make them different. Now, when you write fantasy, especially traditional fantasy with like full-on world building and things like that, rather than say your urban fantasy, which often takes place in a world that's very similar to ours or exactly like ours, but just with that kind of fantastical element, there's a lot more layers to create. And that's what we're kind of talking about. So we're not talking about your urban fantasy level. We're talking about your traditional fantasy level where it's like you've got a whole unusual world and then a load of characters to boot. World laid out and everything. You then have to populate the world with characters, memorable characters. You know, they have to stand out. So this means creating characters can be a little bit more challenging than, say, creating a regular human character interacting in a human world, even if there's elements of fantasticism. That is not a word. Fantastical elements.
I mean, it can be a word for the podcast. We make a lot of stuff up. I gotta say, I'm kind of surprised we haven't talked about this on the podcast before, like deep diving into fantasy characters. Because I know we talk about fantasy quite a bit, especially since that's what you mainly write in. So when we refer to our own writing, we talk about fantasy, but I don't think we've ever really done fantasy catered episodes.
No, I don't. I think it may be because you assume, well, you know, if you're writing fantasy, you just know, but not everyone does. And maybe someone's out there who wants to write fantasy and has never tried fantasy and is thinking about it and is getting a bit overwhelmed, because it can be overwhelming, especially when you sit there thinking, well, how do you create this and how do you create that? But I don't know. Yeah, it's a weird one that we have never touched on.
I know, yeah, it's kind of funny that we've never touched upon it, but fantasy is a complex genre and there are many subgenres that go along with it, and writing or creating fantasy characters is no joke, really, because there's a lot of rules that go into it. And I mean, much like with any genre, any novel, but I think fantasy especially, there's a lot to keep track of, even if you're not writing a huge world or anything like that. But fantasy characters and all the different races, there's a lot to keep track of. So I'm just going to let Ari take this one away.
I will try not to butcher it. Okay, so if we're talking about characters, creating characters and what to consider, firstly, you need to think about what are your characters. Are they beings from myths and legends, things that we are already aware about, such as sirens and elves? Like these kinds of beings all come from with a specific look of how we're used to seeing them. Now, I say that in general, but obviously a little caveat. Culture across the world has terms for creatures like sirens, and they may look different. It's just like dragons. If we take dragons, which is like a more of a beast creature, you go to one area of the world and they have an image of what a dragon looks like. You go to another area of the world, they have another image of what a dragon looks like. So even within our own human world or real world, we have different looks for different species of creatures and myths and legends and everything. But I think you'll often find similar characteristics in a lot of them. So if you are creating a set of characters or a race, and it's coming from a species that has already been created in myths, legends, or other stories, you have kind of a basic template that you can work on and build onto. But you remember, you don't have to stick to that. Now, if I take my story, The Blessed, working title, I really need to come up with a title. It's starting to stress me out that I haven't come up with one yet. I have sirens in it. However, they don't really resemble what is often depicted as sirens. Again, depending on your depiction. Now, sirens have been described, I think, originally as like bird-like women, and then that got changed to like mermaids, like half fish, half human. And then that sort of morphed into human-like in appearance, but they lived under the sea and they were, when they weren't singing men to their doom. But they had this kind of alluring look. And obviously they had the song. Now, let's just say my sirens look a bit different. They don't have this kind of like ethereal beauty that kind of captures people's attention, and then the song comes up. No, no, they don't. They're definitely not good-looking characters. They're kind of monstrous. They do still have the song that lures you into the water, though, because that was obviously a big part of the concept of siren. But yeah, so I amended the version of siren in my story to look something different. And I was like, as long as I made sure I made a note of what it looked like so I could reference it, that's what I wanted to do. And you can do that with everything. It's like you can have fairies or elves that have wings. You can have them without wings. You could have them with horns. You could have them without horns. You could have trolls that are really small that live in caves. You could have huge ones that are the size of mountains. There's all this thing where we have these myths and legends and ideas, but you don't have to stick rigidly to them. And yes, you will probably get some purists who read it going, I don't think that trolls should look like that. You're going to get that with anything, so you just pass on that.
I think that's one of the greatest things about creating fantasy characters. And I mean, you can say this about any fictional story, no matter what genre you write in, but fantasy especially, you have so many real world experiences that you can draw upon and just make it your own. And I like, Ari, you have the similarity of sirens, like their biggest, God, what's the word? Their biggest trait is the singing and luring people to their death and whatever, but you gave them you put your own spin on it. So you took one concept of sirens and then added your own little ingredient to it. And I think that's one of the best things about any book. I mean, we've talked about this before. There are no unique ideas, really. It's only just however you put your own spin on it. I don't think that sentence made sense, but I'm going with it. Hopefully you guys know what I'm talking about. But I with fantasy characters, I think that's the best way to create them. You take because all fiction stems from someplace. It all comes from some real life experience or place or being, whatever it is, even if it's a myth or a legend. It all comes from somewhere, and then you just kind of tweak it. And I agree with Ari, make sure you keep notes so that you can remember the differences that you made, so that you're not going on Wikipedia or Google and you're looking up a picture of a siren, for example, and saying, I don't think mine looks like that. Like, you got to remember the differences that you made and make it clear to the reader that this belongs in your fantasy world, not other typical fantasy worlds.
That is perfect. It belongs in your fantasy world. Couldn't have said it better myself. That is a big thing, because I think people can get a bit like, oh, it doesn't look like it should look. That there's no should. You can make changes. You can have things different. That is the whole essence of fantasy and fiction. It's not real. That's the whole point. So if we're thinking about creating characters, it's very similar to what you would do with other characters, kind of. So your basics is, right, what do they look like? What is their description? And this should be more than obviously your skin color, your hair color, your hair, anything like that. You want to be looking at specific aspects, specific looks, whether that is something like physical and genetic, like if you wanted to have your fairies with pointed ears, that would be a biological or genetic component of that race. If they have markings or something, but that is specific to maybe age, maybe as they get older, they get certain markings on their body or things like that. you can regard the ones where it's connected to a culture almost, so like the clothing they wear, the jewelry they wear, whether they have markings on their body, such as like tattoos or scarring, anything like that, that may connect specifically to that species and maybe a ritual or a culture within that group of characters. They can all kind of build an essence of, just rather than going, oh yes, it's a fairy, they've got pointed ears, that's it. It's like, okay, again, nothing wrong with that. That's the basic. But if you wanted to make it more specific to you, is there different types of fairy? Do they have different looks? I mean, even if you go back to the original concepts of the Fae from Celtic mythology, when you're talking about the Seelie and unseelie courts, they were very different. It wasn't just everyone's tall with long blonde hair and pale skin and pointed ears. It's like, nope. It really wasn't, especially if you're in the unseelie court. So even within a group of your characters, a group of your of a race of characters you've created, there can be differences as well. Like again, being annoying, I'm using one of my stories with the Blessed. I have a group of characters and they're all winged characters, but within those characters there are differences. So you've got, most of them have these like giant bird wings, but then you've also got rigid wings that look more like what you'd expect from a dragonfly or a butterfly. And so that's like subsectioning them. So they're all still one race, but they've got like sub races within them, if that makes sense. That's something you can do when you create a group of characters that are based on a specific species. I think when it comes to physical looks, that is usually the main one if your characters are looking humanoid but not fully human. But it doesn't mean that you have to have all your fantasy characters looking humanoid but not human. And just to give you an example, I mean, technically, was it human? I don't know. I'm going to pull an example, it's going to go wrong. But in the Sword of Truth book series, if you ever read it, there was a character called Mother Confessor. Now, human looking character, everything about that, but they had something different. They had a very specific role within in the culture. They also had a very specific power, and it kind of separated them out. And in case you didn't know, the Mother Confessor was like the final arbiter of truth, but she also had the magical ability to touch someone, and then because they kind of lost all their will to her, they had to tell the truth. The problem with that is they then kind of never got their will back, and they were just almost like a slave. Good story though, good book series if you ever haven't read it. So it doesn't have to be this, oh, it has to look a certain way. It's like, no, you can have human looking characters and you make them fantastical with either a cultural thing or a magical thing like that. Is any of this sounding good? Honestly feel like I'm just...
No, what you're saying is making sense, because let me bounce off with another example for all my gamers out there. If you've ever played the Legend of Zelda series, then that's a prime example of different races and cultures coming together, because the protagonist Link and Princess Zelda, they are Hylians. So they're essentially the humanoids, but they all have pointed ears. So you can kind of say that they have elf features as well. You have the Gorons, who are literal rock people, and they live in the mountains. You have the Zoras, that are the water people. The Rito are the winged people. And you got Gerudo, which is a group of women. And they have, like, their background is, the main bad guy, Ganondorf. I think it's one male is born to the Gerudo every 1,000 years, I think it is. And that's Ganondorf. So the Gerudo women follow Ganondorf, but Ganondorf is the bad guy. But, not all Gerudo women are bad. And then you also have the Kokiri. If you're thinking specifically Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, you have the Kokiri inhabitants. They're all children. They never grow up. They just live in the forest, and they're all, there's so many different things that you can do, and you can pinpoint traits from all of these races and tie them to real life myths, legends, what we see in real life, anything like that. And again, as we said, just put your own spin on it. And there's so many different things that you can do when it comes to looks, when it comes to their culture. As Ari just explained, just have fun with it, essentially. Make it your own and make sure that it all ties in with the plot somehow. And because a lot of these different races, they're all going to have different strengths and different weaknesses. For example, in The Legend of Zelda, the Rito people, they have wings, they can fly. The Zora people, they live underwater, they can breathe underwater. They obviously can't fly. So there's all these, you just gotta, I mean, much like with any character, they got to have flaws and then they got to have their strengths. And it's really important to keep all of that separate, especially when you're creating your own races. You need to make sure that you have your head on straight and keep everything organized and you remember it all so that your readers can also get to know these new races, these new characters.
Well, that's it, exactly. If they don't have very large, obvious physical differences to what we call like a human look, they can still be enough. Let's take hobbits. They look human. The only difference is they're naturally shorter. Their whole race is naturally shorter. They obviously have the big fuzzy feet. Let's be honest, we know people who have fuzzy feet. We've been to beaches, we've seen that, but they're long-lived as well. They live for a very long time. Is it something like they can be 40 and they're still considered children? I kind of get that. You've got even just something as simple as that. It's like, yes, they look like people, but they have these specific traits that are specific to their race that define them as what they are. And once you've got that kind of thought down, what are the characters, what do they look like, and things like that, then you can sort of expand outwards into culture, because culture is another thing that helps us define differences. That's a good thing. We should have different cultures. And even if you just take, again, if we take our own world, we have very different cultures across the world for how we deal with death, for how we have weddings, for family units, for rituals that we might go through, how we eat. I mean, goodness, we from knives and forks to chopsticks to using our fingers, there's a whole different range just for how people consume food. Something as simple as that.
I love how you used utensils as an example, and I'm just sitting here thinking of hobbits and all the meals that they eat throughout the day.
Yes. Let's be honest, it's mostly potatoes.
I'm not upset about that. Potatoes are delightful.
No, exactly. But yeah, so you want to be able to define your fantasy characters with things that go beyond the physical and what clothes they wear or anything like that. So thinking of culture, thinking of specific things, which can be how they react to situations. Are they sad when someone dies? Are they celebratory when someone dies? Not in a ha ha ha, you're dead, but more in a we celebrate the life, not the passing. Do they think, wow, the next world they're going to is going to be so great, I'm so happy for them? How do they deal with the language? Now, I'm going to say something, please be careful when dealing with language. Yes, Tolkien created his own language. He was very proficient and spent many years. I don't personally recommend writing a new language because depending on what words you create, you could just be pulling letters together. You might be using words that are offensive in other places. I don't recommend it. You can just state that your characters speak this language. Like, again, my story has 5 different realms, like 5 different kingdoms, and they all have their own language. However, there is the common tongue that they all have to speak because, the High King says so. So when I'm having my characters from certain kingdoms talk, it'll be saying they spoke in that language, and then they shifted to common tongue when somebody else came by. I don't need to create a whole language. I don't need to start pulling letters together and making a whole dictionary. Don't do that. It's a lot of work. Unless you're a linguist and you really feel the urge, I wouldn't waste my time. But do consider that, if you've got a whole world, does everybody speak the same language? And if so, why? And does nobody have their own language, even if it's a dying language? There's something to think about because that can be a big thing. I mean, again, even in our world, we have languages where there aren't always exact words for each other. So we might have a word in, say, English that isn't, there is no exact complementary word in, say, any other country. Wow, my whole brain just went. Say in Austria, there's no comparable word exactly that matches something like that. The same with governance. How are your people governed? Do they have a single leader? Do they have a matriarch, a patriarch? Is it community led? Is it everyone's in their own separate group and then they all fight about it? But yeah, is it like, are they all following an elder? Are they following a council? Or have they lost their way and it's literally just family groups? That's it, just family groups all doing their own thing. It's very similar to how you would think of if you were creating a human world with humans on it that wasn't similar to ours. Like if you've ever done is it the alternative fiction where it's kind of our world, but it's different. There's been something that's shifted quite big. And if you do that, you might end up having different cultures and different governance and different transport. It's like that. But that's where a lot of your fantasy characters can come alive. It's the detail beyond the physicality, if that makes sense. This is a really crap episode. I apologize in advance. I started making notes, then something happened. I didn't get back to my notes, and I just had like very, very brief thoughts, and I have not got the best head on today. So this is not the best episode.
No, it is a good episode. You're sharing a lot of useful information, and I think the bullet points of it help because in the long run, it's not like there's no blueprint to creating characters, let alone fantasy characters. There's research that needs to be done. You need to read other fantasy like books within your genre, within similar like plots and tropes and stuff that you have, and see how they create their characters. Don't copy them, obviously. I gotta say that. But you can learn from those other authors, learn from those other stories, and you can figure. And here's the thing: we talk about planning and pantsing and all that stuff, but you're never, even if you are a planner, it's going to be difficult for you to sit down and create these races and all of these brand new characters from scratch and then just whip them all together into a story. Things are going to change as you write. You're going to realize that you wrote yourself into a hole or you forgot something about a certain government or language or something. So it's not that you can create your fantasy characters and you can just write them into a story. It's a constant process of creating these characters, and it's something that you need to always keep in the back of your mind, something you always need to keep up with and make sure that it's clear for yourself and for your readers. I know I've repeated myself several times, sorry, but I got to keep saying it. And I do want to bounce back real quick with the language part. Did you know, I'm saying this as a brief fun fact because I just recently learned this. Did you know that Tolkien was a philologist? I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right.
A what?
It's a legit thing. Hold on.
Is it about languages? Because I know it was about languages, but I didn't know what that was called.
Yes, it's a legit thing. According to vocabulary.com, a philologist, again, don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, is someone who studies the history of languages, especially by looking closely at literature. And apparently Tolkien was fluent in like a handful of languages. And when I say handful, I mean like, I don't know, 10, 15. This dude was wild.
Which would explain why he probably felt extremely confident to create his own language. I don't think any of us have that level of understanding or research.
No.
So again, don't make up your own language unless you're really sure you're going to do a good job. I mean, I appreciate, the whole Klingon language that became a thing in the Star Trek series, and people learned it. Which is amusing, always amusing.
People have learned Elvish too from Tolkien. I mean, it's amazing to me all the things this man did. So strive to be like Tolkien, but just be careful about it because really no one can match Tolkien. Sorry, not sorry.
True, that is true. It's like he's like the pinnacle, but we're never gonna get there. I'm just saying that now. I'm just saying it now. Where am I going with the rest of this? Give me a second. You made some really good points, and I was going to say something.
I was going to say, I love how we're like, this is how you can do this, this, and this. But Tolkien did it better, so don't even try.
Yeah. But that's good. You should always look to someone who did things better and aim for that. And if you happen to surpass that, then you find the next person who's better and aim for that too. There's nothing wrong with moving the bar up. I know that also sounds a little bit bad, but yeah, I know what I'm talking about. Yes, you were saying about like, the research and everything, and that's a good point. Research, and you mentioned reading other fantasy books, which is great. I also want to recommend, if you are serious about writing fantasy, especially if you're talking like high level epic fantasy, lots of world building, lots of different characters, lots of different species and races, and that kind of detail, consider doing research on cultures around the world to get an idea of the differences, even in something as simple as like humans. And it can be the difference between one country next door to the other country. It's not like, well, the people on this side of the world are so different from people on that side of the world. Differences can be right next door. So go and do some research on different cultures and different, like, I can't remember the fucking word, different peoples around the world. I recommend getting books out the library. 2 reasons. Firstly, books are awesome. Secondly, we should be supporting our libraries. Thirdly, there's so much garbage on the internet anymore. I don't trust that most of it's even legit. So if you're going to do it properly, get a book out. Let's get back to reading books, supporting our libraries, and supporting other authors who spent that time researching it. If you have the option to travel, not everyone does, go to some of those countries and find out, learn about this stuff. I appreciate that it's a hugely privileged option. Most of us can't do that. Some of us don't want to do it because we hate flying and we don't like traveling. But if that's a possibility, try that. Talk to people within those different cultures politely and respectfully. Please don't be a dick if you're speaking to someone from another culture and you're asking questions. Please be polite and thoughtful about what you're asking. Just want to put that in. But yeah, so it can be interesting. And shockingly, things like that, learning about other cultures, can actually give you ideas and thoughts. Just like one little thing might trigger another story idea, because who doesn't need more story ideas? So, so the basics of this is your characters will start with the concept of the race and the physicality look of that, and then it will move to the deeper section, which usually comes from culture, which comes from how we react to things, how we develop our rituals. And I say rituals, and people might go, what rituals? How we bury our dead, how we do christenings, or how we honor people when they get married, or have hand fastings, or any form of like unity, how we deal with our elderly, how we meet strangers, how we deal with things like that. All these little things, all these little like points build up how characters react and how characters are. And that will be where the difference comes in. So don't just think, yes, we're going to have some centaurs over here and some sirens over here and a couple of angels over there. That's great. Fine. But go a bit deeper. It can't just be, well, this person's half horse, this one's got wings, that one sits in the sea. Done. Fantasy is definitely about detail. In my opinion, let's not get anyone jumping down my throat by saying that, but yeah. Okay, I am so sorry to everybody who's listening to this. I really am. I hope it was mostly okay. I think there's going to be a lot of editing.
Oh, I think it was good. You did a good job, Ari.
In my defense, for the last week, I've had the most horrific toothache, and I've been on really strong, horrible antibiotics that's made me very sick. I'm actually a lot better now, but I'm going to use that as an excuse for being so terrible in this episode. Okay, before we leave, if you want to learn anything more about us, the podcast, opportunities to be a guest on the show, don't forget to check out our website at themerrywriterpodcast.podbean.com. Now we'll turn it over to you guys. Do you write fantasy characters? Tell us about them in the comments and let us chat about it. We'd like to hear about your different characters. Remember, we do release new episodes every Wednesday. Next week, we're discussing tracking your whip's progress. To ensure you don't miss it, hit the subscribe button on your way out. And as always, thanks for listening to the Merry Writer Podcast. We'll see you next week. This podcast is brought to you by Another Notebook. Just because. The music titled Inspired is by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons 4.0.